Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the live Q&A for this month. So this month, I wanted to talk about goal writing because this is something that we're commonly thinking about at the beginning of the school year, and actually really all through the school year. And so because I get a lot of questions about this, I know we've got a lot of new members coming in, I wanted to address some common questions that I get about writing goals, some overall philosophies about writing goals, because really a lot of people come in and they want a goal bank. And while goal banks can sometimes be useful, they can also be counterproductive if we don't have a good process for writing goals and if we're not using the right problem solving process to come up with our goals. So yeah, today I wanted to just go through some examples, some specific philosophies on writing goals to just provide some clarity and some examples related to some things that come up. Um, Before we even get started, though, I wanted to just share that if you are brand new to language therapy advanced foundations, you definitely want to check out the SPOT framework guide. This is one of the program manuals. So if you go into your materials library, there is a section on evaluations and data collection. And so this is going to give you some examples of how to write goals and just how to think about this in a way that is aligned with thinking about standards and curricular alignment, but also making things measurable and attainable as well. So that's a good place to start. And then also, if you are new to the group and you have questions about writing goals around some specific area, definitely use the search function in this group because we have had some great discussions in here about goals. I like to give the framework first and the overview because I found that that helps people to get the big picture. If we jump in and start thinking about evaluations and goals before we get the framework, it's really hard to know how to do that. If you don't know what the areas are that you're focusing on, it's hard to know what data you need in order to do that, and it's also hard to write goals. So that's why I teach the framework first before I get into things like goals and data collection. And what many people find is that you don't have to rewrite all of your goals just because you are changing the strategies that you're using for your students. The strategies that you're using are just a means to get to the end goal. Many times, yes, you might make some tweaks to your goals, but really, sometimes what you're really changing is the strategy that you're using in order to help your students. So keep that in mind. Make sure that you check out the SPOT framework guide. And if you do have questions about goals, just go through the program, learn the process. And if you do, as you're working with specific students, have questions about specific cases, definitely post them in the group. So with that all being said, I wanted to go through some things that come up, some ways that I have changed my philosophy on writing goals over the last 10, 15 years as I've been teaching clinicians, as I've been learning more, as I have really fine-tuned my own strategies as well. So I wanted to just share some different philosophies on goal writing and how really what we want to do is avoid going to the extremes with any of these things that I'm going to share. There is no one magical way to write goals, but I do have a framework that I use. I have some recommended starting points. I have some thought processes that you can use for doing that. And we want to just understand the benefits and the drawbacks of writing goals in certain ways. Because, again, we are measuring things that are internal processes. There's no perfect way to do it. So we've always got to find that balance. So something that comes up a lot, and if I were to go back to my special ed training, many of you are probably familiar with the SMART format. So specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. And the big one that comes out a lot is that we want to make sure that our goals are measurable. That is how, with a lot of the legal mandates that have come down the line in the last 20 years or so, there's a big push on accountability. So many of you may have found that the leadership in your building, they want you to make your goals measurable. So That's a very reasonable thing to ask for if we don't know what we're measuring, if we don't have any measurement tools in education, whether it be through formal assessments or through IEP goals that are not norm referenced, but are ways that we can measure progress, then it's really hard to systematize things. Keep in mind that your school administrators are focused on operating procedures and scalable systems. If they want to lead a whole district and think about things like change management, they do have to create operating procedures and processes and rules for doing things. And so that's why there is this big push when we're thinking about top-down changes, both in bigger picture legal related things as well as changes within the entire school districts. That's why there is that big push on accountability, making things measurable. So yes, we do need those things to some extent. The challenge becomes that if we get too rigid in that thinking, that we do lose the bigger picture of what are we actually trying to teach kids. So let me give you some examples of some goals that I often use and some things that are often useful within the context of teaching vocabulary that do really follow that format. And then some other things that are a little bit, I would say, that are kind of vague as far as the language goes, that make it challenging to actually measure your goals. One of the most common examples of using vague, fluffy language is something like "will demonstrate understanding." Again, if you say "will demonstrate understanding," we're not really sure what the measurable behavior is. We don't really know what we can physically observe. So that was one thing that was kind of, driven, very, very much emphasized in my special ed doctoral program, was that some of those vague terms where it's like, what do we actually mean when we say "will demonstrate understanding"? How do we know if someone is understanding something? Well, what does that actually look like? So that is one very specific example of how people were making these vague statements and we weren't really sure what we were asking kids to do. As a result, it made it hard for us to be able to track progress. It made it difficult for people to understand what interventions needed to be planned and those types of things. So how do we demonstrate understanding? For example, maybe we can you can demonstrate understanding by answering a question. You can demonstrate understanding by retelling a statement. You can demonstrate understanding of a vocabulary word by describing its meaning. So those are all ways that we can take that language and make things very specific and create goals that are things that we can actually observe. So some of the recommendations that I have in the SPOT framework guide, for example, if you want a strategy that's going to help build your students' vocabulary and give you something that's measurable, one thing that is a common go-to is defining and describing words and stating how many features you want kids to be able to name and describe, and even getting specific about the type of features you want them to name. That is one way that we can make a goal functional, but then also make it measurable at the same time. Some other things that we can do to make things very tangible is that we might say, student will say sentences with and specify the type of sentence type. Specify the type of structure that we want to see in the sentence. Specify whether we want them to write the sentence or say the sentence. The other thing that is a common goal that you might have on your IEPs are being able to answer questions, being able to answer questions about inferences and main ideas, being able to retell things. All of those things state measurable behaviors. Now, with those bigger picture comprehension goals, you want to make sure that you also have some specific language goals in there, because a lot of times when we're talking about bigger picture comprehension and students are maybe struggling with syntax and vocabulary, a lot of times they're not able to answer the comprehension questions because maybe they don't know how to structure their sentences the right way. Maybe they weren't comprehending the vocabulary. So you want to make sure that you understand all the different levels of this. But those things that I just said are examples that I give in the SPOT guide and are also things that you can physically observe. So That is where I would start with your goal writing. Now, the caveat with that is that those things that I just mentioned do require some internal planning. So I would say that some of them, depending on which one you're talking about, are kind of borderline on, is it a strategy versus is it an observable behavior? Is it the end goal versus is it one of the steps that we need to take in order to get to the end goal? And here is where things get a little bit messy, especially when you're thinking about things like language versus executive functioning. So, where this gets kind of fuzzy is that a lot of times when people are writing IEP goals, they are focused on external behaviors. So, as a person who is in special education, as a teacher, we do have to be focused on external behaviors. We can't really measure anything if we can't see something. So we do have to do that. So even if I were to go broader, this, in addition to those language goals that I just mentioned, this could also be things like being able to spell words with certain spelling patterns, being able to read and decode words, being able to write a paragraph with specific components in it, being able to do specific types of math problems or types of word problems. These are all physical, tangible things that are very reasonable goals to be on an IEP. But remember that they are external things. So when we think about goal writing, whether we're thinking about language or whether we are collaborating with teachers to think about how do we support students, we do want to start there and make sure that we have those external things. But what we want to avoid doing is we want to make sure that we're not just laser focused on the external. We also want to make sure that we have a good understanding of the internal things that need to happen in order to get to that end goal. I'm going to use a writing example because this is something where I've kind of gone back and forth and kind of revised how I think about writing. And this is actually something that I have given in course materials that I've created in the past, where I've changed my thinking somewhat. So if you have a student, for example, and you want them, the goal at the end of the year is that you want them to write an essay with certain components in it. The external thing that you want them to do is write that paragraph with the right, all the things that need to be there, whether you have goals for the grammatical structures that need to be in the sentences, whether you have the certain details that need to be in the paragraphs, the certain structure, the genre of whatever the type of writing is. So a lot of times special ed teachers will write a goal, like we'll write a 5-paragraph essay with an introductory statement and 3 details and a conclusion. So that is an example of an external end goal. You need to have that if you are working on writing with a student. But where we want to make sure that we also understand the process is that there might be some steps and strategies that a student needs to take in order to get to that end goal that are going to help facilitate the process. What I used to think, and my kind of old way of thinking, is that we want to focus on that end goal first and foremost. If you have a goal for something like will fill out a graphic organizer, my question with that was always, well, do you want them to fill out the graphic organizer, or do you just really care about, the bottom line, the end goal? Well, yes, we do need to focus on the goal, but if the student is not able to get to the end goal because they have an executive functioning issue and they are struggling to do all of these internal things that require them to plan and do research, then yes, it does make sense for you to write goals for the other steps in the process to get there. That's where I have changed my thinking somewhat, because there are times when people get so focused on the end and the final product that they don't actually teach the student what they need to do to get there. So yes, focus on observable things with language. All of those things that I mentioned and all the things that I mentioned in the SPOT framework are very tangible, but make sure that in your therapy, you are addressing those internal things. And if you feel like your plan is going to be made clearer by writing a goal about a strategy to get to the end, then it might make sense to do it. Typically, with language, the things that I outline in the Spot Framework Guide are sufficient. We don't need to get too into strategy work because if you are familiar with the program and the framework, you're doing that strategic work. You're showing your students how to look up words and how to think about things and how to engage in the self-talk needed to describe words. You don't necessarily have to write a goal about that if you're doing it in therapy and your students are clearly working through that process, but you could if you wanted to. Where I see it being more of an issue, where I see there needing to be a bit more emphasis on strategies, would be those situations where you have something with multiple steps, like a writing assignment, like a math word problem, where yes, you probably do need to write something that is more of a strategy-based goal, especially if you have students who are working on executive functioning. Now, in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, I focus more on the language aspects. I focus more on the executive functioning and how to think about goals for that in my other program, the School of Clinical Leadership. But I did want to give you an overview of how to start thinking about these things. Some examples of strategy-based goals. A lot of times you might be a person who is involved in this conversation as an SLP, but you might not be the person directly implementing all of these things. A very common situation would be maybe that you have your language goals. These are the things you're working on in direct therapy. And then maybe you might collaborate with a special ed teacher, with a reading teacher, math teacher. Special ed teacher would probably be the main person, but you might be collaborating with somebody else and they might be writing those goals. You might have some input. You might be co-implementing, but they can give you some guidance on what those specific academic standards are so that you can figure out what's our end goal. And then do we need to make some goals for strategies? Some examples of strategies would be, again, the graphic organizer one, using a visual schedule, generating a list of ideas and assignments, things like that, creating some kind of a calendar or a strategy to manage assignments. Now, this is a whole side conversation because a lot of times the way these strategies are used isn't super effective because they're kind of done for students. That's a whole side conversation. You want to make sure that you're actually teaching students how to go through these steps instead of just, having them copy down a list. Again, that's a whole side conversation, but those are some examples of strategy goals versus, the end goal, the tangible goal. And again, there are ways that you can make strategy-based goals measurable so that you can actually track, is the student actually doing the thing effectively? So, like I said, for academic stuff, traditional academic stuff, even for some of the language and vocabulary things, sticking to the typical SMART format works pretty well, as long as you don't forget that there are some internal planning things, there's some self-talk and strategies that we need to do in our therapy in order to get to the goal. You can follow that typical format there, but when you are thinking about some of those other more independent functioning, executive functioning things and working with your team, this is something that's going to be more of a collaborative process that's going to be outside just what you do in your language therapy. Then it makes sense to start thinking about those strategies. So if you are just new to this program, I would recommend get clear on what you're doing in your language therapy first, get your plan down, get really solid there, get comfortable with some of the strategies that you're doing and the goals that you have there. And then you can start, once you get solid in your therapy, then you can start thinking about those other bigger picture things that you can do as a team member. Because, again, it's you can only, as a clinician, think about one thing at a time. And it does make sense for you to get one protocol set at a time and then think about the other aspect of your job. Not that you're neglecting it, but maybe it's just not your main focus and your main priority. So it's okay to do that. I think that's what a lot of people do when they are learning something new. You do need to give yourself grace and give yourself time to focus on one thing at a time so that you don't spread yourself too thin. Another thing that I wanted to think about, or that I wanted to talk about with goals that comes up a lot, is the idea of, do we focus on what the student's doing, or do we focus on the prompts and put the prompts in the goal? I would say that if you asked me this question 5 years ago, I would say you don't necessarily need to put the prompt in the goal, because the goal should be what you want the student to do. The prompt is what you're doing to scaffold and get your student to the goal. So, a lot of people would disagree with me on that, and I do think that there are cases when it is appropriate to write prompts in the goal. But let me just go back to what I had said originally about why I felt that we really do need to focus on what the student is doing. So I would say that when you are going through your process for writing goals and thinking through just, you've got your goal in front of you and you're writing the goal, the first thing that you need to think about is, what is the student doing? What am I wanting the student to do? Do I want them to say a word? Do I want them to describe something? Do I want them to show me that they can recall a command? And for that, it would be following directions, something like that. I know that there are a lot of thoughts on following directions goals, and that's again, it's okay to do if you're assessing comprehension. You don't want to make them too rigid and compliance-based, but those are some examples. Again, the main thing is that the first step in writing your goal is, what is the student doing? In your sentence structure of your goal, what's the behavior? So start there. And then you can add those things like, number of accuracy, 3 out of 4 trials. And then you can start to think about, does it make sense for me to say something else about the context or how I might prompt the student to get to this behavior? So my initial thought was, and this is one way of thinking about scaffolding, is, do you want the student to do the behavior or do the task independently without a prompt? Does it make sense to think about making the task strategically more difficult, but expecting them to do it independently? So the way that you're scaffolding is that you're strategically making the task more and more difficult. And in that case, it might not make sense for you to write a ton of prompts in the goal. You might not have to say something like, with minimal assistance. You could just say, student will define and describe words. You don't need to put something like, when given a lot of times people will put that language and they'll say, when given a verbal prompt, when given an auditory prompt, when given a picture, when given a word. It doesn't always, you don't necessarily always have to give every single context, because you don't want to funnel yourself in too much with goals. You want there to be flexibility to use a number of different prompts, to use a number of different contexts. So my question to people when they start putting those things in the beginning of goals is that necessary? Do you really need to put that information in there, or is that something that you can just document in your notes? And is that something that you can just experiment with throughout the year? You don't necessarily always have to define every single way that you're going to prompt and assist students in the goals. Now, there are places that if a student needs an accommodation, typically there might be a place for you to write accommodations in a student's IEP. And so if that's the case, then yes, you definitely want to give a student accommodations if they need them. So I'm just saying that just because they're not in the goal, sometimes it should be assumed. Maybe it might make more sense for you to put the accommodation in the accommodation section of the IEP instead of in the goal, because then you can apply them to all the goals. So that is something to think about and just something to ask yourself. I'm not saying we should never do it. Sometimes it might make sense if there is something specific that they need in order to do whatever it is you're asking them to do. But what I have found is that a lot of times people get carried away with this, and they have this huge goal that's like a paragraph long, and it's like, given a verbal prompt, given pictures, given this, all of these things where Of course, we want to do all of those things, but it might not be necessary for us to list all of them in the goal because you're not able to, you're not ever going to possibly be able to clarify and list every single prompt in a goal. So if you're trying to do that, it's kind of a losing battle. And number two, those things should be assumed. It's therapy. Of course, you're providing scaffolding. So it might not be necessary for you to pinpoint all of those things in the goal. And sometimes when you write too much in the goal, we kind of get lost from what the goal actually is. I have read goals before where they're so wordy that it's like, what am I actually, what are you asking the student to do again? So if you are looking at a goal, what you want to ask yourself is, does this information add clarity, or is it just distracting from what I actually want the student to do? The other thing that is kind of a problem with when you start putting some of that additional language in goals is that sometimes people will say things like with minimal assistance and with fading prompts. Yes, of course, we do want to do fading prompts, but sometimes people don't really know what that means. So if you add that to the goal and people don't know what it means, it doesn't actually add any additional information. So if in that context you look at it and it's kind of unclear what it's actually adding, you might be able to take it out of your goal. So those are some things to think about. My question is always, what is this adding? Is it adding something or is it distracting? And there are many times when I ask people that and they're like, you know what, I really think they need to have this type of a prompt or this type of assistance, and I can't put it in the accommodations because it's just relevant to this one specific goal. Okay, fine, leave it in the goal. But it's just, there's not one way to do it, and you just want to be able to ask yourself these questions. I wanted to also speak to the idea of fading prompts because there are times when that is a more appropriate way for you to scaffold than gradually increasing the difficulty level of the behavior. Okay, and I'm going to give, sometimes there's not one clear way to do it. You can kind of play around with them both, but I'm going to give one example of that and how the goal language can vary depending on what you're asking the student to do. So let's say that you have a student who needs to work on writing. They have some work that they need to do at the sentence level, and then they need to work at the paragraph level as well. Let's say that you have some specific sentence types that you're working on with them. And if you are in Language Therapy Advanced, go to the Ultimate Guides to Syntax. I do give you some specific ways to write goals in there. So one way that you can have students work through this, if you wanted to err on the side of, I'm not going to put a prompt in the goal, I'm just going to make the goal gradually more difficult, you could, for example, have a goal for writing a simple sentence. Then you could make it more difficult by writing a compound sentence. You could make that even more difficult. And then the next goal up could be a complex sentence. So you can gradually make those behaviors and those things that you're asking kids to do more and more difficult. And instead of saying that you're going to add a bunch of prompting in the goal, you could just say, the way that I'm going to help students to increase their level of independence is by putting more and more difficult things in front of them. So that's one way you could think about writing goals. And there's other examples as well. Now, in that situation, because you have a very structured task, it could make sense to err on the side of scaffolding by gradually increasing the difficulty level of the behavior, because it is a very specific task. It's relevant, it will generalize, but it's very specific. And you can kind of control the number of trials and the difficulty level of that task. Now, what if you are having a student write a paragraph and you want in the session to be able to have the student write the entire paragraph, but there are a lot of steps in that process. You want them to get to the end of the process, but you know that they're going to need help along the way. Well, it might not make sense for you to have the student just fill out the graphic organizer and stop. You probably want them to do the research, fill out the graphic organizer, plan out how they're going to write their paragraph, write the draft, proofread the draft, edit the draft, And then again, you want to get them to get to that end goal in that process. So in that situation, it might make more sense for you to write the goal and put with fading prompts in that goal, because it doesn't make sense in that context to gradually increase the difficulty level. It might make sense for you to walk the student through the entire process and make it less and less, or actually make it more and more difficult by fading your assistance in the process to when you might cue or redirect. So that's how you can think about whether or not it makes sense for you to put something like with fading prompts and with minimal assistance. Even though the challenge with something like that is that sometimes there is some ambiguity on what you actually mean by that, but it's still something that we can put in there. Sometimes it's just really hard to be specific in these goals when we have all these different things that we're thinking about when we're talking about behaviors that are internal cognitive processes. So we can't get away from all the ambiguity. We just want to try to make our goals as clear as possible and think about what we're actually doing and what we're trying to accomplish. So another example of when it might be appropriate to work on something with fading prompts is if you have some student who, if you're working on something more functional like cleaning a room or packing their bag, well, you don't want to have them stop in the middle of that process. You want them to finish the whole thing. And so in that case, again, when you're working on something that's more along the lines of working on executive functioning and that high level planning, then it does make sense for you to just have them do the whole thing and then use the scaffolding in a way that is just fading the prompts. And that is a case where it would make sense for you to say with fading prompts in the goal. So this is just how we might want to think about these things, because a lot of times when people ask about goals, or when I see examples of goals in goal banks and on social media, the examples are given and I'll read the goal and they'll seem so wordy and confusing, and there's not a lot of context for the thought process that went into the goal. And a lot of times I'll read it and I'll think, I'll read some of these goals and think, well, that doesn't really make sense. But again, if you don't understand the process behind it, then it is really difficult to tell if they're appropriate or not. And so that's why there is a lot of nuance to this. So I wanted to just sum up what I've talked about today. First of all, if you are new to the program, check out the SPOT framework guide in the materials library. Again, go to your evals and data collection section. And then also there are more specific examples of goals in the ultimate guides to syntax, which again is in the materials library in the syntax section, but also is in module 4 as they come up. So those are some specific examples of goals. And again, that will make more sense as you go through the program. But if you go through the program and look at all of that, and you've got a student and you need some assistance in writing goals, definitely share the case in here. And I'm happy to help you go back and forth and problem solve. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, yes, it does make sense for you to start with an observable behavior when you're thinking about something more academic, language-based. That is a good place to start. Start with that behavior and then start to think about how you want to state the accuracy and whether or not it makes sense for you to list the type of prompt that you're given. Again, that is totally dependent on what you are asking the student to do and how much you think that additional information is adding to the goal. And then finally, again, there's a difference between looking at a measurable behavior and looking at the strategy. The main thing is that we always want to be thinking about both things. We want to be thinking about the end goal, the external thing, and linking that to the internal things that happen. Whether or not we actually physically write those in the goals or the accommodations just depends on how much support is in place and depends on the context. We want to make sure that we are doing both. The goals and the accommodations on the IEP are just a means to actually make sure that those things are in place. That is always the end goal of any type of IEP, goals, evaluation, any of those things. The point is always to make sure Are we working on the right things with the student? And are we giving them the supports that they need? So if that's happening, you don't want to lose too much sleep over how you're writing the goals. And then one other thing that I would add is that I do think that a lot of times people try to cram a bunch of things in their goals because they're worried that people aren't going to give students the support that they need if they don't. And typically speaking, if a student is not getting the support that they need and the team is not on board, writing all of that into the goal is probably not the most effective way to do that. You probably have more of a leadership and teaming issue. Yes, it is good to write a goal that clarifies those things, but also there's probably some additional things that need to happen in order for that student to actually get the support that they need. Chances are if you have people that aren't on board and you write all that stuff into the goal, then the IEP just kind of gets shoved in the drawer and not fully implemented. So try to avoid that mental trap. I do think people sometimes get in that, like, I've got to have all of this on the IEP perfectly. Again, the IEP is important. You want to make sure that you're compliant with your paperwork. You want to make sure that things are clear. But ultimately, what you want to do is make sure that the student is getting what they need. So always keep that goal in mind, is that, I know that a lot of people stress about goals. That's why I've spent a whole 40 minutes today talking about it, because I know that it's something that's on your mind and is very challenging. But ultimately, you just want to make sure that the students are getting what they need. My philosophy on paperwork is always get it done as efficiently as possible and make sure everybody's on the same page. Get it done so you can focus on the important stuff. So I hope this was helpful. Like I said, I wanted to give some additional examples of things that are strategies versus things that are tangible goals. Don't worry too much about this. Focus on the language goals. Focus on making things observable and measurable. And then once you get comfortable with that, then you can start to think about how to incorporate some of those other strategy-based goals into the process, because, again, that's something that is going to require some more creative team building and problem solving. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. I hope this was helpful. And as always, please make sure to post any questions you have in the group.